just to say that no, we are coming out of a period of about 20, 30 years of developing our cities in a very bold way with great visions. Now it was a time of optimism and a lot of funding, and even smaller cities in England, like Bradford here, were obtaining and purchasing and commissioning enormous visions about what the city could be like. The same applies to architecture. Architectural visions were very ambitious, even in cities that didn't need that kind of ambition. I don't know whether you can guess where this is. It could be anywhere, but it's actually Leeds. And we never really needed that kind of building in terms of space demand, but we were actually proposing those kind of buildings only about 4 or 5 years ago. We also, in the last 30, 40 years, transformed our core cities in England, and we developed new ways of living, including a lot of consumption and a lot of coffee drinking, and very pleasant lifestyles for those who could afford it. But in the same time, all that investment seemed to have been happening in the centres of the core cities. Just in the centre, around the centre, in most of the 9 core cities in England, and small towns as well, there's a ring of the most deprived neighbourhoods, and they are kind of within walking distance of the booming centres. And they usually access through this kind of approach. You know when you're leaving the buoyant, happy area and you're about to enter the deprived one, but very, very few people do that. Very few people cross these bridges, except when they live there. And as soon as you get into those neighbourhoods, there's a very different atmosphere, less joyous. There is more fear, there is more neglect, there is more hopelessness, and a lot of people live there. And somehow, that 30-year boom that we just had didn't seem to have touched those kind of major problems within our cities. By 2008, I think that probably will be the year which we'll all remember. All of that has come to an abrupt end. So all that joy that we had, all the development, all that optimism is now appearing to have been a little bit overblown. And there is a bit of a bubble. And we now, in most cities, have a lot of surplus demand. My office is actually doing our own research project, mapping the margin of the city centre, which was where all the expansion was happening, to see what's happened to that new development. And it's becoming empty so quickly that we can't keep up with photographing it. That whole margin of recent expansion is void at the moment, especially in places like Leeds. So, of course, this is probably good news, because it means that there is now time to rethink some of the things that we've been doing. Not everything that we've done in the time of boom has been successful. In fact, time will only show just how much of it has been successful. We need not 30, 40-year perspective to really understand what succeeded, but there are early signs now that a lot of it was wrong. So we should capture this, this moment to have these different conversations. And I think one of the biggest conversations that's happening everywhere is about values, values of our society. What has led us to have this massive boom, which did not succeed that well for everybody, and what actually makes us happy as a society. So a lot of debate about happiness, because I think we all know that happiness doesn't seem to rise with amount of money. It seems to have the same level after we can secure our own well-being, shelter and food. After that moment, more money doesn't give you additional happiness. We also know that certain forms of trading have survived extraordinary things. They survived plagues, things like markets in Dewsbury. We'll be hearing from later on. The market was open, I think, in 1600. It operated for about 100 years. Then they closed for 200 years after a plague, and reopened in the same place 200 years later, and is still there. Certain things survive much better than others, certain forms of urbanity. We also begin to return to the idea of making. Making is everywhere at the moment. These waves of fashions are incredible, which could happen out of the blue. So on television, we have the best tailor of the year, the young tailor of the year, the young joiner of the year. VNA have done an amazing exhibition about power of making. hack spaces, fab labs are being set up everywhere. Now, this is a big thing, but also to do with repairing and recycling. You know, we are beginning to understand the value and the pleasure of it, not to mention, you know, the amount of joy that we get just from personal relationships and from being able to do nice things for each other. It's one of the greatest sources of happiness. So we were considering this, but what makes us happy, we're also looking at how valuable this very expensive regeneration that we've been doing is. You know, most cities got beautiful places now. This is Nottingham. Every city in England now has a fountain. Whether we can actually maintain them is a different matter, but it's great to have them. So we had this period of very, very heavy investment. Some of it was very ambitious. You know, it'd be very nice, interesting to see how many years it will be now, how many decades will pass before we can commission another piece of work like this. This is in Newcastle, the blue carpet. Will there ever be an appetite for this again, or how long will it take for us to have it? It is not likely to happen within the next 10 years, that's for sure. And then really to ask ourselves questions, you know, do we need these beautiful spaces to do the nice things that we like to do in public realm, like dancing? You know, this is very nice, very, very nice. And in Brighton, they say they're doing the dancing because they got this new shared service. But is this actually true? Because in other places, you can do lovely things collectively on very bad pavements. So what is more important? You know, is it more important to dance together, or is it more important to have a beautiful surface, or are both of them completely essential for our civilization? And also, you know, ask the questions about what the public realm is for, really. Again, the same kind of question. Is it about us coming together, or is it about showcasing a livable city? Because you know, for the last 30 years, British cities got into this incredible league mentality when we all had to have special, unique selling point and compete in global leagues. And it led to some very silly things happening in our cities, like this one, for example. So, you know, enormous amount of capital funding for a building in Sheffield which didn't have any purpose, didn't have a business plan. That was the Museum of Pop Music. Failed within a year. Struggled for another 3 years to find another user. It's inflexible. It's not really. It's now a student union. I think it probably works quite well. The Dome we know is now successful, but it had 3 years of being empty as well. So is this really the right way to develop our cities? Whilst at the same time, you know, there's so much land which is still neglected. So this is from Leeds. Now we had this boom, a lot of high-rise housing. Because of urban white paper, it was almost like a license to build high. So we built high without questioning it. Our developers were very keen to build high. The planning authorities were not ready for it. They didn't have any policies in place, any strategies in place. And the result is that we got this very strange urbanity now of high-density blocks next to completely empty spaces. So the question I'm leading up to here is, is there another way of developing? Why are we not being more organic about it? Do we need to control everything? Do we need to have policy for everything? This is Dewsbury, Muslim community moving in, developing what they need for worship in a way that they can afford, without borrowing any money, collecting money from the community, doing what they can by just converting a couple of terraces. In probably 10 or 20 years' time, there will be another mosque, but at the moment, they're doing it within their means. And that creates a very nice, very kind of urbanity that seems to be in touch with the needs of its population. So far, I was just giving an overview of why we're looking at temporary urbanism and what it might be. The reason why we combined 3 essays from Denmark and 3 essays from England is that in Denmark at the moment, the local authorities and designers really embraced this idea of not doing things in a rush, of actually testing things out. One of the examples here is in Copenhagen. They're trying to take the streets away from the cars, as I'm sure you know, by giving it more and more space to the bicycles. But they're not doing this by just changing the whole system overnight. They are testing what works and what doesn't work. So this is one of the biggest streets in Copenhagen, goes right across east to west of Copenhagen. And this is a place of experiment for the next 3 years, or even 4 years. They're going to be taking a bit more, every 6 months, they take a little bit more for the lane, do a bit of temporary work to keep everybody safe, but not much. And then they measure everything, measure to see, are there more accidents? and then they take a bit more and a bit more. I've been back now over 2 years, and every time this is a bit more. And I think they're coming to a point now when they probably can't do anymore. But it's done in a low-key, thoughtful way, with lots of feedback. They're also really committing to changing the transport system, and they're committing to well-being. You know, they are saying in Copenhagen that it's not enough just to regenerate. What we should really focus on is well-being of our citizens, and it should be well-being of all our citizens. So their priorities in terms of regeneration are quite different from the ones we had here for the last 30 years. Their starting point is very different. So we're doing other temporary experiments. This is one to do with bookshops. It's kind of temporary bookshops. So they pull these out. This is a council project. They pull them out in different parts of Copenhagen, and again test for about 3 or 4 months to see how they're doing there, and then they move them to another place and see whether there is what happens around this market in other places before they decide whether to continue doing this or actually place it in one place. They're also experimenting with how to regenerate neighborhoods in a temporary way. These are all experiments to test what works, what doesn't. They produced 400 chairs. They designed them specially for one neighborhood, one very, very deprived neighborhood, which is divided in half. And these chairs and this little building are designed to bring people together, give opportunity for people to come together and create their own moments and their own projects. And these chairs are traveling all over the neighborhood. Sometimes they cross the road. They certainly, you can see from the pattern how they left, what kind of arrangements, who was actually using them. And they produced was very, very cheap, tiny buildings. They just had those little buildings are community spaces. They just have an enormous table and a tea and coffee making facility, and that's all there is in there. And they really just facilitate people talking to each other. And then more experiments, very, very low key, really cheap. You know, the most expensive thing here is the camera, the projector for the wall, for the film showing. It's a multi-purpose space that local communities decide how to use. And it's also Copenhagen who influenced the New York event 2 years ago called the Summer City, where young girls suggested a project where, rather than spending vast amounts of money changing all the major streets, overnight, basically, the streets were painted out with very cheap paint, and spaces were transformed from this kind of condition of lots of cars, just little space painted. People colonized it really, really quickly. And by the middle of the summer, they were really, really colonized, and all sorts of subculture emerged. And they did it in about 10 different spaces. I got masses of slides. It's really, really exciting. And this was all temporary. And of course, we got the same here. Festivals can transform places completely, and they're quite temporary. Hay on Wye Festival, it takes 40 years, I think, to achieve real change. The second-hand bookshops and the festival in Hay on Wye have really, really transformed that place in a very low-key, organic way. So, just to finish off, I'll just go back to the first one, to the last one. The same is happening in other places in England. You know, Copenhagen are doing very exciting things, but we're also doing them here.